go forward and start joining. So here we go. So we are live at this point, in theory. No attendees here. We'll wait another minute or two. Here's Joe. Hello, Joe.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Joe.
Hi, Joe.
We have Natalie twice. So we have one attendee. The Linden letter. So why don't we call this continuation of our November 3rd meeting to order. Reg Foster is here.
Penny Kirk here.
Eleanor, you're second in command.
Oh, Eleanor Evans here.
Ed Scheidler here.
Janice Bennett here.
We have a quorum, and notice of this meeting was provided by the Secretary of the Needham Housing Authority in a notice that was posted last Thursday, setting forth the date, time, and agenda and place of the meeting. This place being yet another Zoom meeting as permitted by the amendments to the Massachusetts Open Meeting Law, Chapter 30A, Section 20, which allows a public body to meet by Zoom during this pandemic period. So here we are. The agenda for tonight is to basically continue the meeting where we left off last week. I have no chair announcements to add at the beginning here. I would just, let me do share screen sharing. Let me turn that on. So Natalie, you or Joe can show the presentation or anything else we want to look at. And I would just note, I went back and checked just to make sure, but we managed to make it through pretty much the executive summary of the presentation and the document. And we are now at the section 2, where we're just following the summary that begins section 2, where we're going to dive into the various different options. The goal we had for ourselves is just to sort of do a page turn walkthrough of either the document or the executive or the PowerPoint. And so the document we're talking about starting on page 7, if you guys have a printout there. And in terms of the PowerPoint, which was sent around to everybody the other day, it's slide 8. Do you want to just put that up on the screen so we can just orient ourselves as to where we're at?
All right, I've unmuted myself and it's nice to see everyone again. So let me share my screen. And can people see what looks like the first page of the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, that
Yeah.
looks good.
Yes.
Great, excellent. So then I will go ahead and move us to, I think this here is the page, was this page 8 or page 10?
It's it's page 8 in the print that I made here. And yeah, and it would go on to 9 and 10. Maybe 11, where we're going to talk about RAD conversion.
Yeah, I think where we left off last time is we had talked about this table here, and then as you said, Reg, we just kind of what we have to talk now about is the different programs in particular.
Great. All right, and so let's go in. I want to just remind everybody that we also want to do some resident or public input. Here we now have 4 people who've joined us here, but what we decided before is to just kind of work our way through our questions first, which hopefully would get some answers here, and then open up the floor to resident input. Is everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
All right, good. So RAD conversion. Does anybody have any question on this option or comment? And I'll just get it started here just to get the rhythm going. So I looked through this and it doesn't add very much more money. In fact, it seems to subtract money in the current draft model, subject to more analysis. It seems like this option isn't going to make the cut to me from what I read. Because of that, we will be using RAD in some of the subsequent options, but it'll be blended with other things. But just RAD alone doesn't seem very advantageous. The only thing I circled by way of question is, a comment on the report that said it would lock in higher proration and capital funding that is current in place. It locks it in, but it doesn't lock it in as anything that is a vast improvement over what we already have. And it's not likely to change as Cambridge, the analysts at Cambridge finish out the analysis. Am I reading that correctly, Natalie or Margaret?
Yes, exactly. So this is out of all of the conversion programs, this is the one that would bring in the least amount of money. And in part, that's because it's based on the current public housing rents. But what it does is, one of the benefits of RAD is that it gives more certainty for the property because it locks it in. So essentially your rent every year, you have a 20-year HAT contract, and then your rent would also get adjusted for inflation through OCAF adjusters.
But the only amount of debt that would be supported is about $3.7 million based on the current running of the numbers. And that's, half to 3/4 less than some of these other options. Is that right?
Yes, it's very low given the fact that it doesn't really represent a big increase in the operating income.
So I kind of rank this as, in last place after other options we're about to discuss. Does anybody else have any comments or questions?
I would agree it should be last.
Okay. So let's go on to section B, demo disposition. So you can, there we go. It's a slide. Would anybody like to go first on some of these questions, or I can do again another leading question here for confirmation, whichever way any of the commissioners want to go. I'll go. So I go, wow, look at this money. $30 million and change of debt could be supported by this option. It also, gives us this 1-to-1 allocation for Section 8 tenant protection vouchers. But the big caveat there that I kind of circled last time around when Natalie was presenting is sort of like, well, that's a nice dream, but it's probably the way things are looking right now. We're not going to be in bad enough shape to qualify for this option. Is that right, Natalie?
Yeah, so the big, you're right that it's one of the most powerful repositioning programs in the sense that you get the 1-for-1 tenant protection vouchers of the Section 8 fair market rents. You also get fair cloth authority for each of those units. But it does have this very stringent test in order to qualify for it, which is that you have to, the most commonly used one, which is the one that would be open to Needham, is the idea of the property being obsolescent, that it has a specific amount of capital needs that would have to be addressed. And I'm going to flip to this slide here that has some of those, highlights some of the challenges of meeting that test. It focuses on immediate needs, so everything that would have to be replaced within 3 years, also code issues that are being triggered and any life safety items. You're only allowed to, in terms of construction costs, you're only allowed to include replacing items in kind. And also you can't include items that are beyond 5 foot of the outer wall of the building. So it's a really difficult test to meet. When we did our site visit of the 3 properties, the 3 federal properties at Needham, the one that would be most likely to be able to meet it is Captain Robert Cook. But even then, it's a very difficult test to meet, and it can take anywhere 6 to 12 months for HUD to approve it, and it can be a kind of lengthy and difficult approval process. But I would also say that we will be doing the property conditions report for the 3 properties. So if there are items that start coming up that show that there are a lot more code requirements or life safety issues, or there are some other capital needs that weren't apparent to us on our initial walkthrough, then it's certainly an option that could be further explored.
Any comments on that? I have sort of a couple, 3 follow-on questions. One is, and this will come up later, I'm kind of surprised that Captain Robert Cook is kind of worse off. I kind of think of it like that way, needs more fixing up than the 60 bungalows at High Rock Estates. You know, intuitively, I would have thought those buildings that are all approximately 70 years old, you know, and thrown up in 1951, you know, might have been suffering more in some fashion that would cause them to be more expensive to bring up to code and, you know, bring into the 21st century and so forth. What am I missing here?
So I think one of the things in our walkthrough is that in terms of code, there are fewer code related issues relating to single family homes versus multifamily homes, which Captain Robert Cook would qualify for. Captain Robert Cook also, compared to High Rock Estates, has significant envelope issues that would have to be repaired. And then you're also dealing with, you know, having to make sure that fireproofing between the units is all up to date. And while I think both properties have site issues with retaining walls, you know, cracking pavement and that kinds of things, there were also potential issues at Captain Robert Cook around just having to do a little bit more investigation of the drainage, which could potentially be another cost that would be increasing Captain Robert Cook.
Okay. Well, and all to, you know, be confirmed when these existing conditions reports are done. Second one was back to Faircloth. So I'm sort of gradually understanding Faircloth authority as I go over it again and again. And I guess, you know, this will again come up later when some of these options that could be attractive don't provide any Faircloth authority or only partial Faircloth authority. Why, and I understand, why do we care? I mean, can you or Margaret give us a couple of hypotheticals that would lead us to want to hang on to some fair cloth authority, or other hypotheticals where we really don't care anymore once we go through the repositioning?
Sure, I can start off and Margaret just jump in. So one of the reasons why you might care about the Fair Cloth Authority is the fact that it essentially provides you with an additional form of operating subsidy that you could use elsewhere. So, for your estate properties, if you wanted to bump up the operating subsidy there, that Fair Cloth Authority could be used. It's essentially kind of, if you have the Fair Cloth Authority, it is just essentially additional operating subsidy that you could get from HUD. The other aspect too is what we've been seeing in some of these state redevelopment initiatives, and general kind of throughout affordable housing finance. Different funders on the local state levels like to see other types of funding being leveraged. And so there's been some talk around the Fair Cloth Authority as a potential additional resource. And so DHCD is really interested in, if they see a project that has potential of being able to take that essentially dormant Fair Cloth Authority and being able to apply that, that's something that it sees as attractive. But there's also, we talked about this, the Fair Cloth Authority being an additional operating subsidy resource, but there's also ways of thinking about if you have a property, let's say you go through, one of the options that we talked about was this, it's called the Section 22 streamlined voucher conversion. And essentially what it would do, it would also provide a 1-for-1 replacement of the public housing units with the higher Section 8 fair market rent. So it also, like the Section 18 program, really boosts your income, and you would get that immediately upon approval of the application. You wouldn't have to do construction work. In this case, the big difference between Section 22 and Section 18 is for Section 18, you would get the Fair Cloth Authority, but for Section 22, you get that bump immediately. And there are ways of thinking about that additional income that you're getting from year one, ways of being able to stretch that further by, for example, using it to take out debt to help fund other projects, or alternatively kind of creating a local voucher subsidy.
Okay. So did I hear, yes, it might help out with Linden Chambers. Presumably if we, I'm not sure this is going to happen. This may be a pipe dream, but should we do something to acquire East Militia Road, the Heights Road? Those 12 units might help out with that. But aren't there other sources of subsidy, besides Faircloth? There are other ways of doing Linden Chambers, or is it really something that's essential to think about at this stage, is, saving some Faircloth authority in order to make the numbers work with Linden Chambers?
So I'll jump in on this one. This type of subsidy is an operating subsidy that's meant to keep the apartments affordable to the residents at the income levels that you currently serve. And DHCD in particular, in a lot of the grants that they're providing the housing authorities for their state developments, are looking to maximize the amount of outside resources that a housing authority brings to the project, so much so that they don't want to continue to provide any operating subsidy or future capital subsidy, that they'll give you a one-time substantial grant, but they don't want to be able to provide any further operating subsidy. And so they would expect the housing authority to run the new apartments at Linden Chambers just based off the rent that you collect from your residents, and no other operating subsidy unless you can find another source for that subsidy. And and really the sources of that subsidy are your Section 8 resources, a Section 8 subsidy, but Needham does not have a lot of Section 8 resources that it could dedicate to Linden and Chambers. DHCD might give a Project 8 Section 8 vouchers, but that won't be enough to meet, the overall need of the property. And so the Faircloth units, which is really federal public housing operating subsidy, could be in lieu of the state operating subsidy and help underwrite the affordability of the units to your current residents. The low income housing tax credit program will provide potentially a nice capital stream to actually fund the renovations, but a 1-bedroom low income housing tax credit rent is about $1,400 that a resident would need to pay to be able to live in that unit versus your average rent for your elderly development. I don't know it particularly, but my guess is it's somewhere between $350 and $400 per unit per month. And so, the absence of some type of operating subsidy, which is in my experience, almost the hardest subsidy to find, makes it very difficult to reach the affordability and income levels of the current residents that you serve and who are on your waiting list.
Okay. I think I get that. One last
Excuse me,
thought.
Reg,
Mhm.
there are attendees contacting me. They're not allowed to get on.
Well, we have 4 attendees that are on it. Are they using, make sure they're using the new meeting ID number.
Jessica Reese is one of them. I'm sure she has it. And there's a couple of others.
Well, unfortunately, we got 4 people who are on and others that are not. So I don't know quite what to do. It's on, the link is on the town website because I checked it earlier today.
Yeah.
There are 12 meetings scheduled tonight for the town, so you have to scroll all the way down to the bottom. You don't see it right away when you go onto the town calendar website. You've got to, ask for additional things here. So, but we are recording here, so.
Okay.
And
Okay.
I know Ross was having trouble finding the link, but he's on, I believe, so maybe he can email the link to others here. So anyway, Eleanor, you have a question. You have your hand up, let's put it that way.
Yeah, so I guess I was wondering with the Faircloth Authority, if it were to be transferred over to Linden Chambers, does that automatically make us eligible for those operating subsidies? Or is there something that we have to do to get them, or how does that work?
So they wouldn't automatically go over to Linden and Chambers. You would use them as a tool as part of the recapitalization or redevelopment of those sites. You did use a loophole in Faircloth back in 2010 and 11 to add Hierarch Homes estates to your Faircloth number. And that opportunity might come again, but depending upon what happens with the with legislation pending in Washington. But for a property to be eligible for the Faircloth units, they have to pass HUD's inspection criteria and be deemed suitable housing and not have health and safety violations to become part of the federal public housing program. And I know for some housing authorities back in 2010 and 11, where that loophole existed, tried to get some properties to transfer over, but were rejected because the housing quality was not sufficient to meet the HUD requirements for being in addition to the public housing program. So it wouldn't be automatic, but it would be something that I would bet would be able to be worked with to make something beneficial happen at Linden and Chambers.
Thank you. Janice, back to you. While I had a pause, I emailed you the link for getting into the meeting. So if you wouldn't mind forwarding that on.
Yeah, I
Anybody
did,
else?
Reg. I
Great.
did. And
hopefully
I have a
then-
question.
Okay.
I also
Go
have a
ahead.
question.
Yeah.
Is there any way that, you mentioned Captain Robert Cook may be eligible for one of those programs. Is there any way to like split it, or is it all for one?
Great question. I think that's the signal for us to go on to the next slide or two, or option two, because I believe we are going to get into combos soon. Is that right, Natalie?
Yeah, so essentially there are some, a lot of these programs, you would do it on a property basis. So you can choose to do section 18 for one property and another program for another property. So yes, there is that possibility of if you can move forward with one conversion program for a particular property.
Any more questions, Janice? Otherwise, we'll go to Ed here. Ed, you have your hand up?
Yes, I'm looking at the original presentation that was given to us, not the presentation we're looking at the moment. And in the section on Faircloth, we're talking about operating income. Is the operating income listed there? Is that available to be transferred to Linden Chambers, or is it only the Faircloth income?
Yeah, so that's a great question too, because so it really depends on how much of the income that you need to be able to operate the properties, the 3 federal properties. So if you find yourself, let's say, here's the section 22, which has a substantial, income of 3.1 million. If you don't need all of that to operate those 3 properties, there could be a potential of using some of that to create a local subsidy that could be used for Linden or Chambers.
Okay. Now, let's see. We have the administration fee of $167,760 on line 2. And then we have the Faircloth income of $524,160, which totals $691,920. So that total amount of money could be converted to Linden Chambers? The administration fee plus the Faircloth income?
Yeah, so the administration fee, essentially, what it's supposed to provide the housing authority with is some income to be able to administer the vouchers that it would get as part of this program. So to the extent that the housing authority doesn't need that income of 167,000 in order to administer that program, that funding could be used to fund any work at Linden Chambers.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any more questions on this section before we go on to section C, which is the RAD section 18 construction blend or small PHA blend? Okay, let's go on here. So does anybody have questions about this particular option or comments?
Reg, I had my hand up, I put it down, and then I couldn't get it up again fast
Okay,
enough.
go
And I
ahead.
do have a question. How do you rate obsolescence? It seems to me that, if there's 1 or 2 points difference between these different neighborhoods, but certainly Linden Chambers is, I would say, obsolete, and I'm sure they're right about Captain Cook, but how do they go about rating this? Because it's, and I realize one's state and one's federal, so maybe they were just concentrating on the federal, but so that's my question. How do you establish the obsolescence?
Yeah, so HUD, part of section 18, has established essentially calculation, a number that you have to meet, and that's what they define as obsolescence. And what it's related to is the type of building that it is. So in this case, all of the federal properties at Needham are non-elevator buildings. And what it says is, in order to meet the obsolescence threshold, the costs needed to address immediate capital needs or life safety needs at the property have to equal or exceed 57.4% of HUD's total development costs. So HUD publishes these total development costs on an annual basis. And so just to the side here of the slide, you can see what that number is. So for, you'll see that for Seabed's Way, the total construction cost threshold that would have to be met, that this is just for construction costs. It would be 102,000 per unit for Seabed's, 168,000 for Captain Cook, and 171,000 for High Rock Estates. And the reason why Captain Cook and High Rock Estates are higher than Seabed's is because of the larger unit sizes.
So are you saying here that there are two flavors of this Section 18 construction blend? The RAD 18 construction blend, the small PHA construction blend, either one of them, the way you can include upgrades. I circled that, like elevators or other upgrades where you're limited in the previous option. You can't do it there. Can you add solar? I mean, what are examples of other examples of upgrades that you could build in that are allowed because the properties are obsolete without having those upgrades?
Yeah, so for RAD Section 18 blend, whereas Section 18 has very strict rules about what can or can't be included, RAD Section 18 blend is a little bit more flexible. So one of the things is that you aren't just limited to immediate needs in the next 3 years. You can look a little further out than that, but also you can include improvements that are needed for marketability. So,
For
in the
example?
sense of, for example, what that might include, I mean, I think that you'd have to take a look and see what other types of, let's say, senior housing or family housing that's being provided in the area for affordable housing units, and what are standard amenities that are provided as part of that. I'm not sure that adding in elevators would qualify, but it could.
So I guess that's a difference. More
Yeah,
questions?
and I just want to, another point is that for the obsolescence test or the RAD blended test, you have to get to a certain dollar amount. And then once you qualify for that dollar amount, what the exact scope of work you do doesn't have to match exactly that scope of work. Like, so for instance, if you did want to bring in and add solar panels as your scope of work, it may not count towards the calculation of the small blend or the RAD Section 18 construction blend. But it is still work that could move forward if there's funding available to cover that cost, at the same time the balance of the work gets done. But, HUD is really looking at, particularly if they're giving you a valuable resource like a full value Section 8 voucher, they're looking to make sure that you're meeting their definition, and they're not looking to make it, an easy path to do that. So, adding like the cost of solar panels would not factor into the calculation of whether you meet that threshold or not. But, there would be nothing that would prevent you from moving forward absent, having met that threshold a different way.
Okay. Another thing that caught my eye with these two flavors of this construction, RAD Section 18 construction blend, at least for the large, not the small PHA one, is that, but I think it applies to both maybe, is the note here where it says in a high cost market, of which Needham isn't a high cost market, I assume that means high rental cost per month, that we can elect to be increased to 80% RAD units at and with 80% of section 18 RAD at 20%. Does that mean that, you know, eight out of 10 of our units are receiving the higher section 18 compensation? I don't know what to call it here, where, you know, and that brings in more money. Is that what that's basically saying?
So I think, you know, it's a little bit, they have this graduated program for the RAD section 18 construction blend. And the way it works is that, so here on the slide, you can see the different construction thresholds that you have to meet of 30% of housing construction costs, which is the number that HUD publishes, 60%. In order to get to that 80-20% split that you were just talking about, Reg, you first have to meet this threshold of getting to 90% of housing construction costs. And then what happens is if you've met that threshold, then if you're in a high cost market, which is related to the costs of construction, then they bump you up to 80% section 8 and 20% RAD.
As opposed to what you have there above where it says 40 RAD and 60 section 18, it goes to 2080. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Okay. So if we were to redo this, these 3 carats and just make it just Needham specific, then essentially that 90%, if you meet 90% of housing construction costs, then you would get 2080 with 20% being RAD and 80% being section 18.
Okay. One last question. So I was trying to say, you know, do we prefer, based on your analysis so far, do we prefer doing the small PHA blend, given that it makes us shut down our public housing program, no fair cloth, and we have to give away our management of section 8 vouchers to somebody else and lose our fee? Or, you know, are we always going to sort of, however you wind up finishing the analysis and finalize the numbers, the regular RAD section 18 construction blend, based on what we're looking like now, will always be better than the small RAD section 18 blend? Is that, am I reading too much in? That's kind of supposed to be a question.
To the board or to us?
To you, Natalie.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I think it really depends on, you know, what matters to the housing authority. I mean, certainly you pointed out some of the key problems with small PHA blend. The benefit of small PHA blend is that you don't have to prove these construction cost numbers. As long as you're 250 units or below, you can put in an application and you can get that 20% RAD, 80% split. You still have to meet other RAD requirements. You still have to be able to do construction in order to have the conversion take place. And you also have to meet the 20-year viability. But you do have to close out the public housing program. And then it's a question of how much those fair cloth units are worth to you.
And then, as you also pointed out, you can't administer, for whatever reason, the way HUD has put out the notice, you can't administer your own vouchers with that small PHA blend.
So again, if we're get around to sort of deciding we want to hang on to some fair cloth, then we definitely don't want to go down the small PHA blend option.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, you know, if all things being equal between the two options and see you'd want to do the RAD Section 18 blend construction at, trying to get as many of your properties to qualify at 90% of the housing construction costs, so that you're triggering the 20-80 split by construction. Because in that case, you get 80% of your vouchers as Section 18 vouchers. You get to keep your fair cloth, and there's no prohibition against you administering those vouchers yourself.
That was what I was trying to say, but I just didn't have the words.
Yeah,
By
but
way of-
but what we don't know, and this is why the next task is going to be important, is can we make the case of the 90%? And so we'll be working with the outside firm who's going to do the assessment to push really hard at that, knowing the potential value that has for the housing authority and its residents.
So another way, again, to put it is, if we clearly can, be confident after this analysis that we're hitting the 90% threshold for all three properties, then for sure, we don't want to go down the small blend direction, small housing authority blend direction here. All right. Any more questions on this section, or should we go on to section D, which is on page 11? And several slides down the road here. That is slide 20, but looks like
I had my hand up, Reg.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, just jump in if I don't see it. Go ahead, Janice.
Yeah, okay. Getting back to the structures with the elevators. If we don't build up, there's no way that we can expand. Right?
I think we're
Especially
trying to elevators for the existing buildings rather
Right.
than the new. If we do a new building, that will be built with an elevator, I believe. But
Well-
the existing pairs of seabed buildings, that's where, there's an issue. I don't think there's any chance of having elevators in the Robert Cook buildings because of the way they're configured. But perhaps less necessary.
What are they planning on modernizing the Captain Robert Cook? Are they planning on like demoing and rebuilding?
Modernizing.
Okay,
They're only about 40 years old. And, I think the conclusion right now, I mean, again, it all depends on those existing condition reports, if they uncover things that we don't know.
yeah, but they've discovered, I don't know how recently, but the same trouble with the ice dams from Seabed's Way. Captain Robert Cook is the same construction, and that could be an issue with, climate change and all that.
Absolutely. So that after the seabeds disaster, the board back then had an engineering firm go in and evaluate the Cook buildings to see if they had the same construction defects. And they do. And there's a
Yeah,
whole
they do.
engineering report that Cambridge Housing Authority has, and will be an input, to the new firm that comes in and evaluates the Cook buildings. So, and I think that's why, correct me if I'm wrong, Natalie, but why you have Cook listed as the most in need of upgrading is because we know there's a $1.5 million worth of fixes that are needed in the Cook buildings without having, without even having to do any more analysis.
Yes, I mean, if you go to Captain Cook, you can immediately see that there are envelope issues with the roof and the siding that would need to be addressed. But at this point, we're kind of early on where we're trying to see how much resources these repositioning programs can bring in. And then it's kind of a conversation a little further down the road around exactly what type of work is done at each property. As Margaret and Reg mentioned that, these reports are being done, and we'll see based off of that, what are the different conditions that are being highlighted.
And if I may add, I know of some units, the way this Captain Robert Cook is constructed with very high roof structures and first and second stories, and second stories being overlapped onto first stories, and some how do I want to put it? Some people that have been not consistent in reporting certain leaks where water has dripped into units that are overseeing the higher units overseeing the lower units, have caused a lot of inner water damage into the walls with a lot of mold that really hasn't been explored. So that might be an issue that should be really looked into.
Yeah,
Sounds like a good
we'll-
idea.
Yeah, that's a really great suggestion.
Shall we go on to the next section, D? Any more questions? So section 2, voluntary conversion.
Hey, Reg, excuse me. Natalie, my screen is showing an expanded version of what you have on the screen, so I can only get a small portion of the page. I don't know if it's coming from you or coming from me, but if it's from me, I don't know how to correct it. Anybody? I'm on an iPad.
So I guess my question to the group is, are you just seeing the slide, or are you also seeing?
I'm
like,
looking at the slide, but I
things-
can only get a portion of the slide. I can't see the whole slide. Anybody else having that
I'm
problem?
on my computer and I see the slide with all the, tiles with people's videos next to it here.
I see
it's-
D section 22.
If
Yeah,
it's
but-
helpful, it might be worth trying to
Well,
full
Let me,
screen.
all right, let me.
Natalie, one other thing you might want to try is why don't you turn off sharing and turn it back on and see if it resets on Ed's iPad correctly here.
Sure, let me try that.
Ed,
That's
did that
Does that
help?
perfect.
work? Oh, great.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay.
When in doubt, reboot or pull the plug or bang it on the top. Okay,
So are we looking at section 22?
so that's the next one. What's your
Oh.
question on that, Janice? Yeah.
No,
what's your
no, I'm just want to know if on the right slide.
Yep.
Okay.
That's what we're looking at here. So, anybody want to have any questions about section 22?
I would say that I don't think this is for us. Just on the fact that I don't think we're gonna qualify, and that for some reason I tend to think we're better off with one of the blends. So
Well, section 22 doesn't save any of the Faircloth units.
right.
I'll tell you what jumped out at me about section 22, which was, the time value of money section. Because did I read this right, that that's the only one where when we put an application in, all of a sudden the money starts flowing? Is that the point of section 5?
Yes.
Yeah, so
Yes.
section
Go ahead.
22, the way it works is that it's as of right if you have 250 units or less. There are two different versions of section 22. So there's a section 22 that's a little bit harder to qualify for. You just have to show that it's going to cost less to operate these units if they were under the Section 8 program rather than in public housing. But then HUD has come out with an additional program that's a streamlined version. And essentially, if you have 250 units or less, you qualify for it as of right, which Needham would. And then what happens is you would put in one application for the entire federal housing portfolio. And once it gets approved, you start getting those, that higher rent immediately. And so it's a substantial amount of funding. And you also, compared to a lot of the other programs, you wouldn't have to show that you can do construction and close on the construction financing in order to start getting that higher operating income.
And that time value of money for the section 22 is, again, based on the current estimates. And I'm going forward to page 16. There's a table on the report, and I guess you have it right there on the screen, is $1.6 million a year, starting as soon as right away. And I guess you're making the point that now you have 1 year, 10 year, 20 years. I found it hard to kind of look at it with that big a gap, but you're saying these other options somewhere between 1 year and 10 years, they, is the earliest you could expect the additional subsidy to cut in from repositioning. Is that right?
Yeah, so for this analysis, what we really wanted to show is exactly what you pointed out, that if you do section 22, you see that increased operating income right away. Whereas for the other different options, you'd have to be able to do the construction in order to get the operating income. And for the fair cloth, you'd have to have a place to deploy them to in order to get that. And so for this, we just did, it was every 2 years, the housing authority would take on another project. You could certainly either speed this up by, getting more staff and maybe taking on projects simultaneously. So this is not based on, it's just based on some assumptions in order to be able to essentially kind of illustrate what happens if you do section 22 versus one of the other programs. The challenge in terms of programs where you have to do construction in order to finalize the conversion is that you would have to get all of the funding in place in order to be able to fund that construction. So that's getting your tax exempt bonds for the low-income housing tax credits. As of now, there's a little bit of wait in Massachusetts for those tax exempt bonds. You'd also have to get any soft subsidies that might be necessary. So that's also a process. And then you would just have to do the kind of standard steps in order to get to construction, which is procure an architect, work with them on developing drawings, get a contractor on board, and all of that just takes a little bit of time. So that's kind of why we're saying every 2 years, the housing authority would take on another project, but it really depends on what the exactly what the scope of project would be, how much it would require in terms of relocation, outside sources of funding in order to really get a finely detailed, more accurate timeline. But essentially that is kind of the general gist of this table.
So I saw that, that made me not completely dismiss section 22 out of hand. But the thing I'm struggling with is I don't think of the time value of money the way you put it here on this slide here. This is I think of it as something where you're showing the net present value of an income stream or an incremental income stream, I guess, in today. This is sort of showing you what the future value is, but, I'm looking to make my point, if the first line for the RAD section 18 blend, if you're going from 22.7 million to 30 million from year 20 and 25, that's, an additional 2.3 million here. I'm sorry, an additional 7.3 million, but the value of us receiving $7.3 million 20 to 25 years from now, depending on what your hurdle rate today, is a completely, it not worth nearly as much as it seems to be worth the way you're showing in the slide. is there any way we can get this table done the sort of more conventional net present value analysis way? And then we can compare each one of the 4 options with, how valuable they are to us today, based on your assumption that we start a project every two years, which doesn't, sounds like a good assumption. I don't think we're gonna be able to do everything at the same time here.
Yeah, we could certainly look into that.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I
The
mean, I
board
can,
looks- The
I
board
can
looks
follow
kind of
up.
obsolete.
Well, I'm going to be obsolete in 25 years as well. I don't know if that what you just said, Janice. But, because it, to me, that is the huge argument, maybe for section 22, which is a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. Who knows where we're going to be 2, 3, 5, 10 years from now. It's probably not even going to be anybody necessarily that's on the present board, and not because things turn over, not because of any particular kind of bad reason here. And that's a lot of extra money over a first 5 years. I don't even know what hurdle rate you'd use, what the hurdle rate is for a public housing authority to get that kind of money over the time. But that was something that I just wanted to ask about.
I have a question that's related to that, which is for the Faircloth Authority. I thought I remembered last time seeing that. Do we know what the operating, or can we make assumptions about what the operating subsidy will be in the future? I thought I remembered seeing something about that previously. And I see, in terms of, because I'm just also wondering if there's a way to show, if we give up the Faircloth Authority, what the value of it is, and also the present value of that income stream, and to include that in conjunction with what Reg is talking about. Because I think it would be helpful to see what we're giving up, and if the section 22 present value of getting that income sooner rather than later outweighs the the loss of Faircloth Authority income.
No, that's a really great point. So one of the things when you're thinking about the Faircloth income, the way it would be calculated at the end of the day, when you have real units that you can put that Faircloth Authority into, is that you would do a calculation that takes into, there's a kind of a tool by HUD, and it takes into consideration age of the building, type of the building, location. It goes into great amount of detail, and then it produces what essentially would be your operating and capital subsidy for that unit. In terms of, because we don't know exactly what the units are that they would be deployed into, what we did was with this sheet here, this slide shows is we just used $728 per unit. It's based on the AMP rents that Needham's getting. And so you can see here, at the bottom, the two, out of the 4 types of programs that we were recommending as potential paths for the Needham Housing Authority, there are 2 that create the Faircloth Authority. It's the RAD Section 18 construction blend, and then also this kind of mixed program where you would do RAD Section 18 construction blend for Seabeds and Captain Robert Cook, ideally as a combined property because they're adjacent to one another. It is possible that you could do that, and then you might be able to get to the 90% housing construction cost threshold for both, and then also do the Section 22 in order to get for High Rock Estates to get the higher amount of Section 8 FMRs. And so what you're seeing is the RAD Section 18 construction blends across the entire portfolio. We think that would generate 66 Faircloth units. The other mixed kind of approach would generate 60 is what we estimate. And so you have that fair cloth income is roughly for both a little bit above $500,000. Of course, that's on an annual basis. And it really depends on when those units will be kind of, when that fair cloth authority will be deployed, like how far down along the line you'd have to get to have that fair cloth authority. Just as a kind of elaboration on that point is that if you were to think about these projects as happening every 2 years, that fair cloth authority, you're likely kind of, you would have to convert on some of the properties in order to generate that. So if we take this last option here, that's the mixed combined approach of you do a RAD Section 18 construction blend on seabeds and Captain Cook, you would essentially combine the two in that application. You could combine the two for construction. So you'd have to, maybe you would start this project in 2 years. It might take 2 years for it to be completed. That would mean that in 4 years, you would have that 60 fair cloth units that you can then choose to deploy somewhere else. And then if there's just, with all of these programs, there's there's like a timing aspect of it that what we were trying to show with the analysis with the timeline and when the money would come in is that you really get the Section 22 right away. And that analysis does include the use of fair cloth, which is why it takes a little longer for them to really kind of be able to bring in that total potential benefit to the housing authority. That's both the operating income increase, but then also the fair cloth once they're deployed.
So did you just say that on that rightmost column, which is a mix and match, I'm just going to call it that, you're adapting the aspects of the program to the aspects, the most favorable applications to the various developments we have. And so I would hear that as saying, the High Rock Estates, the 60 units there look like they would create the most benefit from us if we went down the Section 22 road. And presumably that's where the 60 fair cloth units come from, is from those 60. And as soon as we get the application in for High Rock Homes, we would start yielding the income potential from that point forward. Although that wouldn't happen with the RAD blend for the other seabeds and Cook units. Did I hear you right on that?
Yeah, let me just clarify that last one, because it was, as we were going through the different programs, we're thinking you're kind of torn between two different options. One option that creates fair cloth units, and one option that kind of maximizes the amount of Section 8 FMRs that a property can get. Mm-hmm. So our thinking for that was, what happens if you get a little bit of both? And so the way that this last option works is that you use RAD Section 18 construction blend for Cook and seabeds. And because Cook has, just on the face of it, what looks like more capital needs, if you were to combine them, maybe we think that, maybe you could meet the 90% housing construction cost threshold, get the 20/80 split for that. Right. That 80% of the Section 18 units that you would get for Cook and seabeds is what generates the fair cloth units.
Oh, okay.
So essentially you would proceed with that as your first conversion. And so let's say that is done in
You're right.
4 years. Yeah. And then essentially what you would do is, here's the kind of timing related complexity with this is, so you're done, you converted Cook and seabeds, you have those 60 fair cloth units. Before you can do Section 22, which would close out on High Rock Estates. That would, if you do section 22 there, it's as of right. You would get that boost immediately. But it would require you to close out your public housing portfolio, which would mean that you would need to deploy the Faircloth units, so 60 Faircloth units, before you proceed with section 22 on High Rock Estates. So essentially what that would look like in terms of your timeline for doing work at the Housing Authority is you want to convert on Cook and Seabeds and do the construction work there, get those 60 Faircloth units, deploy them at Linden Chambers or another new construction project. Once those are deployed, so they need actual physical units to be moved into, then you do section 22 and close out your public housing portfolio and get those section 8 FMR rents for High Rock Estates.
I think I understood what you said, but I think I'm going to have to go back to the recording and listen to it 5 more times.
Okay.
Interesting. And so this timing thing, we're not going to decide on tonight, obviously, and we need to do the final analysis. But that's a deliverable you will be giving to us with the final analysis is, the path we say this is the path we decide to take. It'll also have very clear implications on the order in which the projects need to be done. Did I hear you right on that?
Yes, and I think what we can do in this case is provide something that's more of like a clear timeline of just like you'd start off with this project, you'd have to do this in order to get the full potential benefit, right, of this mix and match.
And I think what I recap from a few minutes ago, if our current funding view of Linden Chambers is that it's, we don't really have a good funding strategy for that, then hanging on, to at least those 60 Faircloth units is going to be important in the overall financial model, funding model is put together if and when we ever get around to doing Linden Chambers. Is that right?
Natalie, do you have the other chart that was on page 20 or page 16 of the report that showed, what you could do for debt from section 22, as well as what you can do for vouchers?
Yeah. Here's the debt one, Margaret.
Yeah. So one of the things we looked at was, if you did what could you do if you had the immediate influx of money from a section 22 conversion? And so we did this analysis and we just picked kind of 3 benchmarks. Your extra income above and beyond what you would be getting to just operate the 3 properties is a little over $1.6 million. And if you pledge 25% of that towards debt, you could borrow $7 million, all the way up to 85%. And you're getting close to $24 million, and you still have some section 18 remaining. And then the second page of the chart, can you get the next one that shows what happens? That, so you can use the extra income in 2 different ways. You can use it to take on extra debt, or potentially you could use it to create a local subsidy program to kind of create create your own Faircloth, so to speak.
Yes.
And so this just showed if you pledged, 10, 30, or 50% of your extra section 22 income, and you did different levels of subsidy, so a shallow subsidy would be kind of what the HCD currently provides you at Linden and Chambers. It would be a little less than Faircloth, but you can get the sense that if you use 30% of your section 22 income, you'd be able to have 101 vouchers. And that could be a way that, that shallow subsidy could be a way that you could support the operating cost of a new Linden and Chambers earlier than if you waited for the Faircloth units to come along. And so, as we look at the time value of the money and we do the present value calculations, this was just another way to kind of think about, what the potential boost, both from a debt carrying point of view and a voucher carrying point of view. And, ultimately you might marry the two and do some debt and some vouchers to move forward on an overall strategy for the housing authority. Absent, an ability to, really maximize your Section 18 full value vouchers that would preserve the fair cloth. So I just, wanted to call that out because that's another way of, looking at the benefit of having added money sooner than later.
Or just tying those two tables together. And I'm going to pick the 50% level because it's in both tables. So you can actually say 50% of your Section 22 new income stream is spent on debt. You can raise $13.8 million worth of debt to fix things up. And you use the other 50% of it for vouchers. You can get 169 vouchers, which is pretty damn close to the 172 units that we have at Linden Chambers. And all of a sudden,
You've
we've got-
basically demonstrated to DHCD that you have a way to actually operate those units as deeply affordable units that then puts you into the running for some of their competitive grants.
And that
Yeah.
competitive grant money is, if we can move the Linden Chambers off of completely of state subsidies, they will let you get a one-time grant that then can be used for good things at Linden Chambers. Did I hear you right on that?
You did.
Wow.
It's competitive though. So like, for instance, right now they have a grant out very similar to that they have $30 million available. They've got 4 housing authorities in the running. The maximum you can get is $15 million. So if they give 2 housing authorities the max, that means they're only funding 2 housing authorities. I think 6 initially applied, 2 got eliminated from the preliminary round, 4 going into the final round, and anywhere between they could fund all 4 at levels that would I think almost every project needs the $15 million for them to be to pencil out.
And does the FCI come in, the Facility Conditions Index? So if you are doing too good a job of maintaining your old state properties, you're not going to make the cut for this limited pot of money.
I think it becomes a factor, but I also think what also is a factor is what outside resources you bring in.
Mhm.
So if you're bringing in a new resource or a federal resource that's different than in expanding the amount of affordability that's out there, I think that can offset some of the having a higher FCI score, which you guys are, I think 15 is the cutoff. I actually have the spreadsheet open right now, and Chambers is at, I think, 16.2, and the 2 Lindens are in the high 20s. And so just, if 15 is the cutoff and you're in the high 20s, you're not going to make it alone on your facilities conditions index.
Absent of a major new infusion of capital, which is there anything like that on the horizon?
Well,
from the state
there's
side?
there's the pending bill that Representative Gerlich is working on with others around how to deploy the opera money, and I think a good chunk of that may go to affordable housing. I think we're likely to, depending upon what the final what passes Congress through the Build Back Better bill that President Biden has positioned, there has been efforts within that program to have a really robust housing funding program. So some of it will be timing to what some of those things will come out as, and that's why I don't think you can immediately dismiss Section 22 from consideration. I think we've got to continue to do our due diligence around trying to really assess where you will fall under the Section 18 elements of of opportunity, because, you know, the Section 18 vouchers are valuable on two fronts, both on as full value vouchers, but also in terms of maintaining that fair cloth authority. But, you know,
Right.
you also are going to want to, you want to be able to move forward and not lose out an opportunity as well. And so that will be part of, you know, the whole equation.
If any board members, Ed, you have a question, I see your hand up, go ahead.
Yes. Going back to the original pamphlet or booklet that was sent out to us, not the PowerPoint. On page 13, which is well, just a discussion about the chart. In the second paragraph in the last sentence, it says, however, it is important to note that any fair cloth units generated as part of the RAD blend / section 22 option would need to be deployed prior to the use of section 22 at High Rock Estates, as that would require the closeout of the public housing program and the loss of all fair cloth units. And my question is, the loss of all fair cloth units, what does that mean? If we have 60 fair cloth units available for the RAD blend and the section 22 blend, and what do we have, like 20 bungalows that we would tear down and replace with duplexes? So if we were to increase, or if we were to use 20 of the fair cloth units and we had 40 left out of the 60, does that mean those 40 units disappear? Am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah, so you're understanding it correctly that essentially if you use section 22, any fair cloth authority that you haven't used would go away.
Okay.
But I think part of the what you would essentially be doing is before you do a section 22 application for High Rock Estates, you would use up the 60 fair cloth units, likely somewhere else other than High Rock Estates, given the fact that you would need to do the conversion at High Rock Estates in order to be able to, likely to be able to fund any needed kind of redevelopment work there. But it just means that what this is referring to is kind of the timeline section of it, that you would start off with the RAD section 18 construction blend that would basically provide you with fair cloth authority. And then before you proceed with section 22, you'd have to deploy it somewhere, because as soon as you do section 22, your public housing portfolio gets closed out, including all of your fair cloth.
Okay.
So it would just kind of, guide the way that how you prioritize the projects moving forward.
When we're talking about 60 units, does that mean 60 new units, or is that modernizing a portion of that 60? Does that count? What does the 60 units represent?
So the 60 units, what that represents is essentially kind of 60 operating subsidies. I don't know if that helps to explain
Okay, so
it.
it's not necessarily 60 new construction units then.
I mean,
No, because, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's confusing, it just happens to match the 60 unit count that's at High Rock Estates, but it could be 60 brand new units, or it could be, 60 units that you put the federal subsidy into.
Okay.
But you would be using the 60, you would need to use them 100% before you would move forward with the balance of the High Rock Homes disposition.
Okay, thank you.
I
So
just ask a follow-up question. So I still don't understand so you say you deploy the 60 fair cloth units, then you do the section 22 at High Rock Estates, and then you close out the program. But do you mean close out the program at High Rock Estates? Or do we still, I'm kind of confused with the 60 units. Are we still, because we deployed them, when you close out, are you closing out only undeployed units? Or are you then
Yeah.
losing those 60 units that you just deployed?
You know, you would maintain those 60
Okay.
those units, but as part of the closeout and really almost as part of the new development, what HUD is doing with these fair cloth units is that they have a process set up where you can do a process where you do public housing straight to RAD, so that you basically, create the unit, but then you transition it almost on the day that you finish it to the RAD program, so that it doesn't stay public housing for very long. It functionally serves the purpose of creating a new subsidized unit, but it quickly moves it into the RAD bucket. And that's been the process that HUD has set up for housing authorities to use these new fair cloth units. It's kind of another streamlined process that they set up. So in reality, once you deploy those fair cloth units, they would switch to RAD. And so then when you close out your High Rock homes with Section 22, the earlier fair cloth units will have already converted in front of High Rock homes.
Let me, just in time management purposes, suggest that we take a pause here and then turn the meeting over to Margaret and Natalie to kind of go through, leading us through the questions they would like to get some guidance from us on. But the pause, we sort of had residents and others sort of patiently waiting to comment. And I, looking at the attendees here, and are there any people or attendees that have a question they want to put in or a comment about what we've been
Thank you,
discussing?
Reg. Thank you for that.
So I see the Linden letter, which I believe is Ross Donald. You should be able to speak. Go ahead, Ross. But you're on mute, so we can't hear you. Now you're not on mute. Try again. We still can't hear you, Ross. No, still can't hear you. I'm going to go to Jessica Reese next. So Ross, I think you've got something technical going on there. And Jessica, we should be able to hear you. Go ahead.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So Janice had already brought up, possible mold and whatnot. And as far as the inspections go, as for the, as far as what you guys decide, whether it be the demolition or the modernization. One of the main issues I think that has created mold is that we don't have very good ventilation in the bathrooms, or I mean, even in I'm in a 2-story unit and my upstairs is always like at 70 or above, and I'll have my temperature gauge down at 62. So I think that's one of the main issues, or something that definitely should be looked at, even regardless of what gets chosen as far as the demolition or the modernization. But there definitely needs to be a new type of ventilation. And that also includes, actually, I'm just remembering the ventilation from the laundry vents, the dryers, the way that it's set up, it makes the shape of a U. And so we're constantly having to clean it out, have housing maintenance come down and clean it out. So you want to think of these things to avoid having to put in more money somewhere else to fix later on at some point, which is what is happening now. So just a thought. Thank you.
Margaret or
Thank you,
Natalie, do you
Jessica.
want to
That's
address
really-
that?
I was just going to thank Jessica for that comment. I mean, that's kind of the input that's really helpful in terms of doing these property conditions reports. And part of the thing that we'll be looking at with the architects is ensuring proper ventilation out of the bathrooms, and also the heating systems are working the way they should be. And we'll definitely look into any issues around water and mold So thank you for that.
Well, isn't this a good point to also emphasize the point you made last meeting, which is your recommendation at the end of this presentation that we schedule a meeting with the various tenant groups. Jessica is our president of our Cooksbridge Tenants Association. So so that, early on when these architects and engineers are coming through and kicking the tires on everything, they get, input like this, that only if you live in the building or live in the units, is it possible to, to get that kind of insight. So what would you recommend we do by way of scheduling these tenant meetings?
Yeah, so that's a great point, Reg. And one thing that we definitely wanted to make sure that we had some time to talk about today. In particular, we think that our recommendation to the housing authority is to start the resident consultation process around all of the repositioning ideas. So it's been really great to today get some feedback from residents as part of this board meeting, but just to go over the programs again, what the potential impacts are to residents, what they mean, and also get a sense from the residents about how they're thinking about these different programs and what their questions and comments might be. So we found that generally it's helpful to have these meetings when possible online, just given some of the digital access issues. In the past, given the fact that COVID is still around, we've held some of these meetings outside when it was possible. It is getting colder by each day, and we are also getting closer to Thanksgiving. So I know that people's schedules are really starting to book up, but we think it would be great if we could start the resident consultation process maybe the week after Thanksgiving. And we'd be looking to hear what the board's thoughts on that are, and if there's a space that's big enough to accommodate the residents from all of the 3 different properties.
Okay. Well, I assume you'll follow up on the details of that with Angie. I don't think I speak out of turn for any of the board members to say that we would welcome that getting going. And all of us believe that as much involvement and participation by the residents as they're willing to give in this process as we go along is going to make it overall a better, overall modernization and redevelopment initiative. So why don't we just make that as an official action item to start scheduling now, so everybody can, and you can figure out logistics like room size and, maybe it's 2 meetings, not 1 meeting. I don't know, that work out those details. Ross, I see that you seem to have dialed in again. Let's see if I've added Ross, you're now should be able to try speaking. I'm going to ask you to unmute. And I don't know which one of these is working here. But we one of your microphones is showing as muted here. No luck. Sorry about that. Well, hopefully you will be able to attend these residents meetings here. Any other questions from the residents? Otherwise, we'll go back to sort of wrapping up this meeting in the next half an hour or so. And hopefully you stay on schedule here. Okay, so back to the board and back to the Cambridge Housing Authority team. I know you have this chapter 6, section 6, plus or minus.
Hello?
Oh, Ross, there you are.
Yes.
You made
Yeah.
it. All right,
All
under
right.
the wire. Go ahead.
All right. Well, I'll just be brief. A lot of we're having a hard time maintaining contact, communicating, and so forth. And it's partly my problem here. I'm dealing with a broken computer and so forth. But the questions are not being answered. Can you read the chat room? I'm posing my questions in the chat room. Well, all right, there it is. Yeah, apparently not. But my question previously that was not answered was regarding the nature of innovation. To the extent that it was answered, it sounded like that it was a matter for residents to decide what the quality of life was going to be and how we're going to make improvements. And the question, the answer on the innovation question seemed to be that it was mostly financial innovations. And Reggie, your comment was a little bit snarky, but to the point. And I need to respond to that because you kind of jokingly said that the innovation was not on the order of plumbing fixtures. Well, that's exactly what we heard from Janice, that is the reality. And I don't think it should be mocked where, this is a geriatric population and some of the designs here are designed in slip and fall, for instance. And if we don't address those issues in terms of quality of life, then the housing authority has no business doing this kind of development, especially for this population. So that's my comment on that. Ventilation, it's ironic that the matter of the disaster of the snowfall and the leaky roofs and everything, it's very interesting. This is another point that we have a great disrespect for people that deal with reality, engineers and contractors. It's like we aren't even talking about buildings here or people. The ASHRAE fundamentals, the American Society of Heating, Cooling, or Refrigeration Engineers, whatever it is, they have in their books, their book of fundamentals, they have no chapter on energy conservation. What falls under energy conservation is the chapter of moisture control. If we really had an appreciation of how building science works and how buildings fail in particular, we'd recognize that as not, it was a moisture problem that led to the leaky roofs and the snow and the buildup. And the further problem was that was known, the residents told, as Janice seemed to want to tell us, this is the feedback that the residents have. It was, at the time, I have an email record. There were residents communicating with the housing authority that this was a potential problem. And sure enough, the roof failed. Anyway, here's the big problem. I'll cut it short. I've got a lot of comments. But here's one of the fundamental things. Those buildings, the small buildings, the veterans housing, they're not bungalows. Can we stop calling them bungalows? I don't know what they are, farmhouses or capes or something, but I'm done. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thanks, Ross. Hopefully you can attend one of the residents meetings next month here. Going back to wrapping this up here, I was saying in section 6, you have this sort of a table that goes across several pages. Natalie and Margaret and Joe, do you want to sort of take us through what you envision as a process to kind of get the kind of feedback you'd like from the board and to wrap up this meeting here? And let's do it. Go ahead.
Reg, before we get there, it looks like Penny has her hand up.
Do you? Penny, you're on mute there.
I didn't mean to have it up. I have taken
Thanks.
it down.
It's hard to watch all the different bits and pieces on the screen at the same time. So, okay, so go for it, Natalie or Margaret or.
Great. Perfect. So one of the things that we quickly wanted to go through as we kind of wrap up this meeting is this assessment tool that we included as part of the report. And it's essentially kind of highlighting that there are, the key part to look at is on the side here called key considerations. So these are some of the items that we've discussed today and also during the previous meetings, which are kind of key points of difference between the different programs and kind of different frameworks for thinking about how do you assess each of the different options based on what the housing authorities, board, staff, and residents' goals and objectives are for these repositioning programs. So I will go through it somewhat quickly. Some of it we've already talked about in some detail today, but we had prepared these slides that were for those key considerations. And these are just going through the different factors. And I think where it would be really helpful to hear from the board and staff and residents is just what of these key, how do you prioritize these key factors? What matters most in terms of meeting the goals and objectives as part of this repositioning? So the first one here is what we talked about earlier today, just the contract levels for the different blue bubbles. Those are essentially those 4 paths for repositioning that we had identified as ones that are beneficial, but also that the housing authority, the 3 federal properties can be eligible for. And so essentially, as we've discussed, the third option, section 22, brings in the highest amount of operating subsidy to the properties. It also brings in that admin fee. But all of the other ones also provide a range from, at the lowest, it's 2.2 million in operating income. The highest is 3.2 million, and they kind of fall within that range. The other aspect, and we talked a little bit about this last time when we met, is the impact on over-income households, what happens to them with these different programs. So generally, what you will see, one thing that is kind of standard across all of the 4 programs is that in terms of resident income will remain 30% of a resident's income. Where you could see a potential rent increase is for residents that are currently paying flat or ceiling rents. And so if that 30% of your income is higher than that flat or ceiling rent for your unit, then essentially you'd be seeing a rent increase, but that you would still be limited to the amount of rent that a tenant pays is 30% of your income. In terms of if you're over income, which is essentially over, currently the program's mostly eligibility for a new resident coming in would be 50% of AMI. And you can be in that unit till 80% of AMI if continuously assisted. So in terms of if someone were to move as part of the construction, temporary relocation, you would have, the Needham Housing Authority can elect to provide a right to return to that resident if they were continuously assisted. One of the big differences here is that one thing that we didn't get to talk a lot about today is that one of the, and this comes up as one of the key factors, section 22, essentially the vouchers that are provided as part of that are mobile vouchers. They're with the tenants, and tenants have to elect to project base their voucher. If you are over income for section 22, you would not be eligible for that mobile voucher. So that's just something to keep in mind for section 22. This kind of is a perfect segue to tenant consent to project base. So as you can see here, where for section 22, which applies to the third option and also to the mix and match fourth option, for that you would have to get the tenant's consent in order to project base that voucher that is generated. The other aspect that we talked a lot about today is retention of fair cloth authority. And so option 2 and option 3, which essentially require you to close out your public housing program, you do not get fair cloth units for that. For the option 1, which is the RAD section 18 construction blend, that would generate the greatest amount of fair cloth units, and the mix and match would generate the second highest amount of fair cloth units. Timing of conversion is another factor. Section 22, that operating income increase is immediate, whereas all other 3 options require construction. Then the requirements for disposition, the section 22 here is probably the most streamlined version. It's as of right, given the fact that you have 250 units or less of public housing, you don't have to show that that you can do construction, whereas all of the other options require construction to occur. Any of the options that include RAD, you would have to show that you meet the 20-year viability, which means that you're doing enough construction and you have enough in your replacement reserve to meet all future capital needs of the property for a 20-year time period. And then option 1 and option 4, the mix and match, you would also have to put in an application that would prove that you can meet this housing construction cost threshold. That's part of the applications. Whereas option 2 and option 3 are as of right, given the amount of public housing units that Needham has. This is a field of acronyms. And so here's 2 new ones, the demolition and disposition transitional funding and the asset repositioning funding. Essentially, the way that this works is HUD is acknowledging that there are some central costs that are covered through the public housing. And so what they're providing as part of some of these programs is some additional funding that's phased over a couple of years in order to assist the housing authority financially with some of those central costs as it moves out of the public housing and into section 8. So option 2 here, which is a small PHA blend, creates the highest amount of additional funding that could be used to assist the housing authority with this transition out of the public housing, with the conversions and out of the public housing. And then option 1 has the second highest, option 4 is the third highest, and section 20, any units that are part of section 22 are not eligible for DDTF or ARF. And then also another topic that we've talked about today, which is the potential of these programs to support the redevelopment of state properties, which we know is a priority of the housing authority to improve the conditions there. If this is a combination of how much fair cloth units do these conversions generate, but also how much additional operating income do the repositioning programs generate, in the sense that if you don't need all of that additional operating income at those properties, and some of that can be used, as Margaret described, to take out debt that could be used to assist in rehabbing or redeveloping other properties. It could also be used to create additional vouchers or a local subsidy. So what you'll find is option 3, which is the section 22, has the highest amount of income that's usable as a local subsidy, but it has no fair cloth. Whereas option 1 creates the highest amount of fair cloth units, provides the lowest amount of additional income that could be used as a local subsidy. So they kind of balance each other out in some ways. And so this brings us to taking the temperature of the housing authority, the board, the staff, and the residents. And this is something that we'll also talk with residents as part of the resident engagement process. But just, you know, out of these factors that I just briefly went through, what are ones that the housing matter more to the housing authority than others? And our reason for including this kind of assessment tool in the report and as part of this presentation is that it just seems like a good framework for each of the programs are slightly different and have their benefits and drawbacks. So it's just a question of getting a sense from the housing authority about what are aspects that it's particularly concerned about, both in terms of its benefits and also its potential risks.
Anybody want to go first?
Yeah, I had a question. It may have been back on one of the other slides, but when it comes to the fair cloth and the reconstruction of seabeds and the remodernization of Captain Robert Cook, and that will allow us 60 fair cloth units. But that does not mean, my question is, will we get additional units for the 60 fair cloth units that we put into the remodernization or the demolition of Linden and Chambers, actually?
Yes, so these, if I understand the question correctly, is that whether or not those fair cloth units could be used in order to renovate or redevelop Linden Chambers?
Yeah, which, you know, yeah, will they demolish Linden Chambers and build new units?
Yeah, so that's one potential way of using that fair cloth subsidy. So if there's a redevelopment and new units are being created, then essentially once those units are you would help subsidize the operations of those new units by putting in those fair cloth units there.
But will we also have to lose the like housing authority units as well?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure that I understand that question.
Well, there were slides put up that said you could lose your housing authority units if you accepted the fair cloth, certain fair cloths.
So I think, I mean, there would still be, you know, they would still be housing authority units. It would just be the subsidy would be coming, you would be getting the operating subsidy through the fair cloth units. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I think what I hear Janice saying, let me try to see if I hear it right, Janice, is if we go through, let's say the mix and match, and that yields up 60 fair cloth units after we're done, leaving out all the timing considerations and everything else we got to get right here. You know, the units that are yielding, they're giving up the fair cloth units as they go through conversion to Section 8. They're still housing authority units, still getting subsidized, you know, and still being made available to people with 50% or less of AMI income, and getting a lot more money on a standalone basis that way. And those 60 freed up Faircloth units can migrate over to Linden Chambers, and be part of the overall funding plan that's put together for Linden Chambers, regardless of what we do. Maybe let's just hypothetically say we decide we're gonna keep Chambers, the brick buildings, and just rehab them and build elevators on them and redevelop Linden. Well, still those 60 freed up Faircloth units can be applied to Linden Chambers, whatever we decide to do with it, and also would serve, could serve as an incentive to DHCD to give us grant money that, because they like to see them getting out of the business of providing state money for the subsidy. That's what I kind of heard your question is, and what I was hearing Natalie's answer to be.
Yeah. No, I was just worried about whether we would have to give up anything here on the federal side. Well, it seems that we would give up here on the federal side to provide for the state side.
Well, you won't need the Faircloth units anymore, because there'll still be 30 family units and 46 elderly units that have been completely modernized and are receiving subsidy through the Section 8 program.
Well, that's my other question. Will the units at Seabeds go up?
Will the rents go up?
No, will the unit capacity go up? Well, we have more than 46.
Right now, I don't know that there is no plan to add more units to Cook in the 2019 facilities master plan, but
No, I'm talking about at Seabeds.
at Seabeds.
Yeah, are they planning to add more units? And,
Yeah.
with
So
the
one of the
with the-
5 projects where it was to add a new 61 unit senior housing building to land that they think they can use in between Cook and Seabeds. If you go back and look at it, it's described, and that's still on the table as a possibility.
Okay, I'm just, want to ask these little questions because I know it's hard for all of us to understand, but for the residents, it could be daunting. So, yeah, okay, thank you.
Anybody else have any other questions or comments?
Penny does.
Go ahead, Penny.
My hand is up. I'll put it down now. I think you're going to find when we get to the part where residents can have some input, there's quite a lot of resistance to that new building at Seabeds.
Possibly, I could see that. Yep.
I think it would be good.
Well, people are going to have different opinions. That you can take that to the bank and be sure of it here. So, but we'll talk it through and be transparent if we can, as we can here.
If we had used the Faircloth to the max at Cook, you'd have leftover units available. You'd have, right? There are what, 35 units at Cook? And so
30.
30. Okay, so there's 60 more that could be applied to Seabeds or across town. Is that right? Could they be split up? Could we use them any way we want?
Yeah, so you could split them up. And I think this kind of ties into what I'm now understanding Janice's question to be, which is, if you're using Faircloth somewhere, are you essentially taking something away from that existing development? And so this Faircloth subsidy is really in addition to that operating income that's being provided to the properties as part of the repositioning. So just for the sake of an easy example, if you have a building and it's got 10 units, and let's say as part of that, you're doing a 20% RAD, 80% Section 8. So you have 8 Section 8 units. For those 8 Section 8 units, you would get 8 Faircloth authority. But you don't need that Faircloth authority for that building. The building's provided 10 voucher units, which are going to subsidize the operations and that are increasing the amount of operating income. That Faircloth unit really becomes essentially an additional operating subsidy that you can use elsewhere. But you've essentially moved the property from public housing to Section 8 in order to get those vouchers, which will bring in more money. I don't know if that helps clarify it or confuses it further. But
Okay, any other comments? Or I don't know if I can do this thermometer. I look at this thermometer much longer here.
No, take
I
that
don't like
off
the
there.
frowny face here at the top here. But I actually would like to suggest that you go back to that slide that we started with, the 4 options, you know, that are sort of, you're saying this on the table. And by the way, those slides you just could you send out those slides as well? Because they weren't in the PowerPoint that you sent the other day.
yes, we will send those out.
I'd like to look at those again. I think they're very useful here. I will tell everybody what I've been doing for the last week is I've been putting little tick marks, you know, thumbs ups and thumbs down, you know, as we go back and forth, and there's all these different moving parts. And the sum total of all my tick marks seems to be centering around option 3 and option 4. You know, sometimes it's option 4 seems like a better idea, you know, the mix and match. And then sometimes the option 3 gets there, you know, kind of gets more tick marks, not because of in numerically, but numerically meaning number of tick marks, but just this business of the time value of money and the cash flow and having it just, you know, start right away. And this action item we did an hour or more ago, you know, to sort of just, you know, expand on that, create a real net present value chart. But if you're asking me where I'm sort of landing, you know, that's, you know, I could be convinced 1, you know, 3 and 4 kind of have been, you know, heading down the stretch of the horse race, sort of neck and neck, and, you know, one ahead of the other, and, you know, depending on which one of those various different, you know, pros and cons that you laid out at the end. So that's kind of where I'm coming out here. And one of the things that makes you know, 4 more attractive is I guess my having struggled for years trying to find a source of funding on the state side, and not, there just isn't there. And when they do come out with funding, it's exactly the way Natalie described. They come out with $30 million for the whole state, all 200 and whatever number of housing authorities like this, all of which have these aging buildings, or many of them which, and it's just sort of a drop in the bucket of the kind of money that's needed. And you know, the general sense I get that, you know, sort of the trend for now has been, or for a long time has been, to try to federalize everything and get out of the state subsidized housing business. You know, Massachusetts being just one of only 4 states that have actually been, you know, spending our resources on this, which is very commendable, but there's a huge number of other priorities committed, you know, competing for the state resources. You know, I keep, you know, kind of gut feel saying that, you know, I know somehow those, you know, 60 Faircloth units that we're estimating would come out of option 4, plus the other advantages of the mix and match, that for some reason or other, we're going to be glad that we have them, and that we haven't really closed out the Section 9 public housing program yet, you know, while we try to get around to Linden Chambers. So that's my 2 cents, worth not much more than that, based on the last couple of days. And I also want to just say thank you very much, because this has just been incredibly informative. I've learned more in the last few days here than I've done sort of banging my head against the wall for the last few years trying to understand how this stuff works. So thank you very much to Natalie and Margaret and Joe. Anybody else
Thanks.
got 2 cents they want to throw in?
I could.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
I'm just gonna
I
put
also
in-
want to, can I take over the screen share for you, to Natalie? Okay. So coming out of the last meeting, I took an action item to go find the key key goals that we did in 2014-13. I couldn't really find them, which was annoying, but I kind of went ahead and reconstructed them based on a conversation we had last time around, and also conversations on and off the last couple of years. Can everybody see this document?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
So, and it's big enough to see. So I just started a list of different kind of key goals, it sort of as something that's ancillary and supplementary to what Natalie and Margaret were asking us for. They say, and I emphasize it says draft here. Nobody's had a chance to look at this, but I've heard it say over and all over again, our number one key goal is to preserve and extend the lifetime of the existing units for 40 or more years if possible. So we're really talking about seabeds and Cook there. And if that's not possible, which is for our other worn out units, which are, Linden Chambers and High Rock, to redevelop them into an equal or greater number of newly constructed units. So they will be there for the next 50 years. And if possible, develop additional new units, like turning the High Rock, I guess they're not bungalows anymore, according to Ross, they're capes, turning those into duplexes. So all of a sudden the 60 units become 120 units. That's a big win, I think, for affordable housing and Needham, deeply affordable housing. The second one is to be, top priority is to, have proactive resident input and involvement during the process. The third one is we've talked about, not so much lately, but to continue to focus on rental units rather than ownership units, which is, we did half of our units in 2005 to 2008 were ownership units. To keep the affordability target, the population that we serve is 50% AMI or lower. Not that there isn't a huge affordable housing issue in Needham, but that
What is the AMI?
An area median income. So the average income of the people in our area.
That's a lot of money.
Well, it is, but right now it means we won't go higher than 50%, which, by the way, is the way Section 8 program reads. It comes packaged that way. That doesn't mean we can't, raise the money to have 40% or 30% or less people here. But we're not talking about affordable housing the way it's defined by the state, which is 80% or less. And sometimes it's 100%. And for now, Section 40B, it's I think it's 80% or less. Which if 50% is a lot of money, 80% is a huge amount of money here. So we can. I'm just saying that we can work on this and say this is what we want, and maybe we add to this and say we would like to have half of our units be 30% units. That's the kind of discussion we had in 2014. That we've talked about this, and I put it down here, that the Needham Housing Authority board and management retain operating management control and governance after whatever we wind up doing with repositioning. Another goal that was in 2014 is to achieve a certain X%, 5 or 10% or something, of ADA compliant units in both the senior housing and the family housing. You know, we've talked about elevators, of course. Another thing is, you know, energy efficiency and green need them, and, you know, the resolution that was adopted by town meeting this fall. And finally, to, you know, provide enhanced resident services, and what else. So when we send around the slides after this meeting, I want to send this around as well for continued work and iteration here. And I'm sure I've forgotten a few things. So, you know, I just wanted to illustrate here.
Looks
Mhm.
good.
Good ideas.
So Natalie and Margaret and Joe, do you need anything else from us here?
I think we're good for tonight. I think we'll circle back and connect with Angie about getting some dates and a location for the resident process to begin, and then look to have that happen, and then come back with more information to the board. At the same time, we'll be moving forward and have moved forward with getting the physical conditions reports for each of the 3 federal sites as well.
Great. Any final comments from anybody else?
Yeah, Marcia, we're just speaking of a resident comment period only, in person or Zoom.
We were hoping and going to recommend in person, but you know, it still is a little concerning in terms of COVID. And so one of the things we'd like to explore is the possibility of seeing if we could use one of the, you know, auditoriums or cafeterias at the school, so we would have a little bit more space to spread out. Because I think both the conference room and the community room at Seabeds and our chambers can be tight if we, you know, get enough people there. But if we go to one of the cafeterias or one of the auditoriums, we'd be able to spread people out. And then it was suggested, and I don't think it's a bad idea, that, you know, we look to potentially hold a couple of, you know, same meetings, different times kind of thing, so that we present the same information, but provided at 2 different times, so that we can break up the numbers so that folks feel comfortable and safe to attend, and we have the right distancing and protocols in place to ensure everybody stays well.
Well, good, that's great, because residents have an awful hard time getting on the Zoom unless they go to community rooms, and, you know, with the weather getting cold again, be nice if we could have it sooner than later, but that's great.
I have a suggestion or two.
Go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Pam.
I was at the community room at Rosemary Lake today. They have a great big room there that might accommodate. And also the senior center has a good sized room. And I'm also thinking that maybe people could be provided with rides to get there. if we
Right.
have Off-site meeting.
I like the Rosemary Lake one. That is an excellent size room.
It's
Just the
beautiful.
kind of side we would need. Yeah, so good suggestion. Anything else from anybody? We're a little bit over schedule here, but pretty close for us, pretty good for us. I thank everybody for the time and investment here, and to be continued, I guess.
Night.
Yeah, a lot of good progress.
We forgot to
Thank
do
you.
this last time around, but
Great
I make a motion
questions.
that we adjourn the meeting. Do I hear a second?
Second,
Good.
All those in favor signify by
Aye.
saying aye.
Aye.
It's
Thanks, everybody.
unanimous, amazingly. Have a nice evening, everybody.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Good night,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Hi, Reg.
Night.